Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. I know this is right before lunch hour, so we'll try and make this not too painful. So really what I'm talking about is hybrid apps with Ember, but every time I come and do a talk like this, I mean, one of the problems is I never do the same one twice because that's boring, so this is totally new content. But I also never know who actually comes. So just quick show of hands, who here writes Ember or has written Ember applications before? Okay, sweet, roughly about half. Who here just is a programmer in general? Okay, great. This means that we don't need to talk about as much business logic and we go straight to codey things. I also like being as interactive as possible, so if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense or you want me to expand, please just prompt me while I'm talking, so much easier for everybody. So who am I? Don't really need to go over this, given the intro just came. I've been on Ember for nearly 3 years now, very, very big fan of the framework. It's obviously changed a lot since I started. I look at some of the Ember apps I wrote 2.5 years ago, and I've rewritten them about 3 times now, just to keep catching up with how the conventions change. Before that, I was Ruby, Rails, Go, all of these wonderful technologies. And then I promise this will be the only plug, but this is what we do. And I say this every talk. If, as I'm speaking, you're thinking, God, I want to throw money at this guy, that is the avenue under which you can do it. And we mostly work on Ember applications at this point. We will touch other things, but we consider ourselves to be an Ember firm. So I just wanted to pop this up. This was, what was in the FITC description of my talk. I hate to say that, when I sat down to write this talk, I completely forgot what I even proposed. But thankfully, we're still actually going to cover these topics, notably, how we build a Cordova app and how we make it not feel like it's a Cordova app. So how we're going to do that, we're just going to quickly cover what are hybrid apps, just to make sure we all have the same baseline. We're going to talk a little bit about our tools, which is noticeably Cordova, Ember, and actually just being a good programmer. And then the bulk of this talk is just going to be tips and tricks I use to make sure that people don't know I've built a Cordova application. At this point, this year, I've probably done about 10 to 12 Cordova-driven applications. The year before, it was probably more than that, but we're not at the end of the year yet, so I do this a lot. So what are hybrid apps? Just quick show of hands again. Who here has built a Cordova or a PhoneGap app before? And who here does or doesn't know what Cordova is? Okay, sweet. So we'll do a really quick definition, and then we'll move on. So what Cordova is it just lets us build a single code base, usually in JavaScript, and we can make that run as a native application on iOS and Android. This is a pipe dream for most programmers. We don't need to go and write native iOS. We don't need to go and write native Android. That's why we do this. That's why it's exciting. And then last question, I promise. Who here knows what the difference is between Cordova and PhoneGap? Okay, great. So now I have a bit of an idea of what to cover. So just beforehand, though, wrapped apps are everywhere. So when we talk about single sourcing or hybrid or whatever word you want to use, a lot of people think mobile immediately. I know that's kind of in my subject. People don't realize as well there's a platform called CEF, Chromium Embedded Framework, if you've heard of it, which is basically a PhoneGap for desktop applications. You can build a Mac application. You can wrap to Windows and do an exe. If you like Windows as well, you can also use Cordova Windows. So sometimes people are a little bit shocked when they realize how many wrapped applications they're actually using. A really good example would be audio. I just took a screenshot of audio because it was an easy one for me to take. You can actually tell when I've been programming a lot just based on what my top albums are, because I tend to just pick an artist and go through their entire catalog, so I don't need to deal with too much change. One of the other ones that shocks a lot of people is that if you use iTunes, the new Apple Music tab is actually a wrapped Ember application. So Apple are actually shipping Ember applications wrapped as well now, which I find very, very exciting, personally. So just a couple of quick reasons that we do this. It's cheaper to build this way. Obviously, we don't need to go and write 2 code bases in 2 languages. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. We can reuse our app for web. I'm going to get into how we do that, but we can have one code base that's actually working on both, and that has some awareness that it's running in Cordova or that it's not running in Cordova, which is important to consider events like, hey, we want to pop open the contact book, or hey, we want to know that the user just lost Wi-Fi, which is pretty important when you're doing a web application. Less cost to add new features. I think this is something that people don't consider enough. That being said, if you're running a startup, I think you maybe overconsider how important a feature is. Sometimes startups believe they can solve every problem they have just by adding new features. If that's what you believe, you probably have much deeper problems than that, and you're fooling yourself. But it's much cheaper to add new stuff, mostly because we don't need to go and write it twice. No out-of-sync experiences. Again, there's nothing worse than having an iOS app and an Android app that does different things. I've worked, obviously I run a consulting company, so I've worked with quite a few environments where the product team gets bogged down or doesn't know what's going on because the iOS does something completely different to Android, and eventually this excuse the French, it just becomes a clusterfuck internally. So as much as you can, you kind of want everything to work the same on every platform. These last 2 points, and these are the last 2 points before we get to the good stuff, are really about self-reflection. So first one is you should really deeply consider what your engineering team is and how they manage complexity and whether they can actually handle a lot of complexity. It's infinitely more complex to be writing Objective-C than it is JavaScript. It's infinitely more complex to be writing Java than JavaScript. So just consider whether this is something that your team can actually achieve, and if building native might be a little bit hard, it's another reason that you want to look at hybrid. But this works the other way as well. If you have a team that only know Objective-C, deciding to go and build a hybrid app is basically nuts because you're moving into a platform that you don't understand. And last point here, how easy is it for you to find engineers? So anybody else here who runs any type of consulting firm will have the same challenge. We have clients, they love us, and they always ask, can we hire you? And the answer is always no. We don't want to do this. If we wanted jobs, we'd have jobs. So it always comes, well, can you find somebody for us to hire? And the answer to that is always no as well. We'd love to help them, but this is the one place where we all need to fight and actually find engineers because it's very difficult. So just deeply consider the state of your engineering team and whether you could actually bring on more people. And this might point you towards, hey, we actually don't have many engineers, and that means we want to go hybrid and stretch it. Or, hey, we have a great funnel for Objective-C people. Going hybrid's probably not the right idea. So just last point on this, perceptions of hybrid apps are, not always the best, but, who gives a fuck about that guy? What's he ever done? So I'm just kidding. That quote is from 2012. And I think this kind of hits a bone with hybrids that people don't realize what they are and what they're for. There are certain apps that work really well. I'll get into that when we're going through best practices, but the more you're dealing with a basic form style app, the better a hybrid app will work. The more you're trying to do a lot of different things, the more a hybrid app will actually start to break down and not feel native. The other thing to consider as well, though, is that's a 2012 opinion. Obviously, we're in the land of front-end frameworks now. People are putting a lot of attention into this. Things have changed a lot, which is what I want to get into. So next section, I just want to very, very quickly cover our tools. Again, it looked like a few people here had touched Ember. A lot of people haven't. So I just want to standardize this on tools, and then we can get to the good stuff. So what is Cordova? We've spoken about that. Interesting little tidbit is that the reason there's a PhoneGap in Cordova naming is that PhoneGap was actually built on a street called Cordova. So that's actually where that namesake comes from. And again, sometimes I come to these things and people don't realize what the difference is between Cordova and PhoneGap. So consider that, I think it was 2012. I'm very, very bad with remembering dates. Adobe decided to open source the PhoneGap codebase. And at this point in time, it was known as PhoneGap. And what they did was they donated that codebase to the Apache Foundation, whose job was to steward that codebase and make sure it would work out well. And that's where that Cordova rename came from. And, sorry, 1 second.
It was always open source.
Yep.
Adobe bought the company Adobe. It was always an open source project. It's just because they bought the trademark, so we had to push all the code to the Apache Foundation.
Yep.
I was working for IBM at the time. I now work for Adobe, and we're doing that PhoneGap stuff for 6 years.
Nice. Yeah, I realize it was always open source. Yeah, and then the easiest way to consider it is that, PhoneGap implements Cordova. Cordova doesn't necessarily implement PhoneGap. Easiest way to think about it. This is just, I wanted to put this up here. I always try and put a couple of points in a slide just to say, if this is a space that's interesting to you, this is something that you should maybe go and Google. So it would be one of the pieces that if you understand, it may be a little bit easy for you to go and build a wrapped application. So go and look at that. Basically, if you're building a Cordova app, you're probably going to be implementing a UI web view. This is the technique under which it will work. The reason we use Cordova is we get mostly consistent APIs as well. I say mostly consistent because, I do some Windows Cordova at times. You don't always get the device APIs that you would otherwise get. That's totally okay. It's open source. Things haven't been built yet. Just want to make sure we all understand that you're not always getting an API access. And then the last tool that we're using here is Ember. So we're in a state where we can run a JavaScript application on the phone. So what we really need is a framework to help us structure that application. And this is really where we get into the stuff I do. I'm much more of an Emberist than anything else. So you could use vanilla JavaScript. You could use Angular if you want. You could use React if you want. I've tried to tailor most of the tips in this talk to be agnostic of Ember so that you could implement this stuff if you really want to. But I'm a big fan of Ember. I think it makes it very easy to structure a broader application, especially when you're considering, I'm a big fan of the action bubbling pattern for anybody who's familiar with that and has written much Ember before. And importantly, you hear this a lot from Ember people, that the Ember way isn't necessarily about Ember. It's really a method of programming and a method of structuring a JavaScript application. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, honestly, just go to guides.ember.js.com, and you'll get a bit of an idea of the philosophy that Ember is rooted in. So the main tool that we use to ship an Ember application, this is Ember specific, is called ember-cli-cordova. If you're writing Ember and you're not on the CLI, you should get on it. At this point, I don't think it's actually a first-class citizen of Ember yet, but it will be very, very soon. And what ember-cli-cordova does is it basically adds Cordova. You can see 4 down to our apps main directory, and it lets us just start running our Cordova commands from the Ember repo and to have Cordova embedded in the Ember repo. Also has a little bit of extra magic just to make stuff easier to interact with Ember and to let you build for web and to build for mobile with your normal Ember CLI. So it saves you from doing a lot of this manually. It's actually gotten a hell of a lot easier. I remember when I was building our first Cordova Ember applications a couple of years ago, none of these toolings existed. So I had to go and actually build the Ember application. Then I had a make file that would go and copy-paste, or not really copy-paste from a make file, but it would move the production-level JavaScript over to the Cordova application. Then we'd have to do all of this embedding and Windows stuff just to make the Ember app run. So if you use ember-cli-cordova, your life becomes a hell of a lot easier. This is just all managed for you. You don't have to do a thing. Sometimes I get a little bit depressed when I think about how many months I spent trying to make stuff like this work, only for a couple of weeks later there'd be an open source package that just handled everything for me. But such is life when you're messing around with these things. So there's a little link down here as well to a fork we have of ember-cli-cordova. So one of the most important things when you're building an Ember application on Cordova, so I keep looking behind here because I got instructed I'm not supposed to move further left than this, so I need to keep track of that, is that you both want your Cordova to be injected as a service in the application and you want access to the bindings. So who here knows what an Ember service is? Okay, so just the high level, imagine an Ember service is an object that has the same state and we can inject it selectively in our application, into routes, into components, into templates, into controllers. A really good, simple example of a service would be a session. Within Ember, if you're using something like SimpleAuth, or even if you're writing your own implementation, a session is a service because you kind of want it to be globally available through the application with the same state. In fact, one of the things I love about handling auth in Ember is that there's always a session. You may have a session that's not authenticated, but you still have a session. And that would be a good idea of what a service is. You'll see here we've injected it, and what this repo will actually do for you is it also will tell you that, hey, the user's gone offline, or hey, the user just pressed their volume button, and it will give you those bindings in Ember. So you don't need to go and do window.cordova and write your own jQuery accessors. You can dump in a route, and you'll see here we have this.getCordova on pause. My pointer is not working, but hopefully you can see that. And we can actually whack it into our normal Ember. Last point that I'm getting in the optimizations, ember-cli-cordova gives you free live reloads. So this is great. I actually work with a USB hub, so I have usually 2 iPhones and 2 Androids plugged in as I'm writing mobile applications. And every time I make a change, it's just automatically going to flash and show up there. This is so helpful, especially I write a lot of front-end code, but I don't consider myself a front-end person from understanding what CSS even does a lot of the time. So it's really helpful to realize that I just accidentally made the window not be high anymore, and I just clipped off 50% of my content. So now we're up to the good stuff. How do we make these apps so that people don't necessarily know that it's not native? So the first thing that I think is important to understand is that there are tricks, but a lot of it's just being a good coder in general and understanding how your JavaScript is going to run. Sometimes I think people mistake that the JavaScript they wrote for desktop was amazing because it worked and it was smooth. That's not an indication. Compared to your phone, a lot of the times this Mac is a supercomputer, and you can actually do a lot dirtier things and get away with it. So a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is just having good code conventions and doing things intelligently. And a lot of these patterns you should be implementing on your website as well. It shouldn't be specific to Cordova. The other thing to remember, and Cordova is not native, you can debate whether that's true or not, but the thing to realize is that its promise isn't that it will give you a native feeling app. Its promise, in many ways, is that you'll get a JavaScript application that you can run on the phone. A lot of it's on you as the programmer to make it feel native and to make your user be happy with that. I think this is sometimes where the batter perceptions come from. I've had a few clients where they'd dumped their application into Cordova, they built it, and they said it felt like garbage, Cordova is shit. And that's not the case. It's just that they'd taken an application that obviously wasn't built to do this, and they were expecting it to give them some magic. In fact, you could say that getting native fill out of Cordova feels just a little bit out of reach. I had to put that in there. I promised I'd put GIFs in my presentation this time, so I did. So really what we're going to do, in some ways this talk is really just shit Alex does in every Cordova app to make it feel better. So the first one is you kind of want to know what web view bounce does. Easiest way to explain it, I was hoping to put some animations in here for this. When you use a website, say on your iPhone, you can actually drag the pane down and you see, depending on what phone you have, this big gray area, right? And that's just a native part of websites. If you go and use, say, Twitter or Facebook, you'll find that that doesn't happen by default. So you kind of want to disable that so that you're not giving a user a tell that, hey, this is a wrapped application. In fact, much more commonly, you want to have a fixed header and then allow that overscroll to happen in some type of container or body. So again, I'll put these slides online. I'm just trying to cover a lot of ground. That's worth going into. One of the other things to consider is just how you're going to handle your touch events. So again, I'm pretty bad with remembering numbers. I think a click has a 300 millisecond delay, which means that when you actually hit that click from the time it fires, it's 300 milliseconds. That's death on a phone, to be honest. You can absolutely tell what's going on, and this leaves that environment where everything feels just a half tick too slow. So you really want to optimize for touch events. Obviously, if you're just doing a really quick implementation, a lot of people are apt to use jQuery and on-touch start. I'm a big fan of using a library called Ember.js. You'll actually, and I'll talk about a library that integrates this with Ember pretty natively as well. But to show you a bit of a sample, what Hammer does, and this is slightly older code. I just went through an area where we'd used Hammer. If anybody's observant, you'd actually notice that I took this from a slightly transparent terminal window, and you can actually see very opaque code below this where I was running an iPhone build or something like that. But what Hammer lets us do, the first thing we do is we add a Hammer manager to the element that we're interested in, and we can start detecting whether a tap happened, whether a press happened, whether a pen or a swipe happened. You're probably also noticing that we can actually detect a tap or a double tap. Hammer will also distinguish whether the user tapped the button or held the button for a good 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. One of the other reasons I'm a big fan of using Hammer is, so I use Ember components a lot, and I'm not a big fan of having the logic to understand that, hey, this was a click or a double click, melded with my standard component logic of what the component's supposed to do. I think they're completely different concerns, and when I consider that, Hammer becomes very, very, very viable. Works really well. The other thing Hammer will do is it will protect you from ghost clicks, which I'll talk about in a second. If you're interested in Hammer and you write Ember, there's actually a library called Ember Gestures, which just completely implements Hammer for you. You don't need to write that code that I just put up on the screen. And then in any component, you can just bind to tap, double tap, press, swipe, pan, whatever it is you're interested in receiving. And just a bit of an example on the screen there, you can see is made a component, and on pan start, that component's going to respond to something. So really good idea to implement something like this. So who here knows what a ghost click is? Okay, a couple. So sometimes, and again, this is just one of those funny ones that once you've seen it once, you know exactly what's going on, but if you've never worked in this environment before, it can be a bit of a mind bender. You can create a touch event. It doesn't mean the click event's not going to fire. So you can end up in this environment where a touch is fired, and then 300 milliseconds later, a click's fired, and these poor developers, I've watched them, and they're watching their console, and they're, why is this happening twice? What's going on? So if you use Hammer, you can actually protect yourself by only firing a touch. If you choose to do bindings by yourself, just absolutely make sure that you're not listening to a click and a touch at the same time. Another little hack if you're an Emberist is that you can actually alias a click as a touch, and that will be handled for you. Just another little Ember-specific hack. Ember link tos, if you're on, I think it's past, if you're on 2.0 and maybe even something past 1.13.5, this is less of a problem. But link tos won't always register unless it's actually a cursor pointer. A couple of reasons to do this. It's just obtuse implementation stuff that will be changing. But if you just tell every A link and absolutely ensure that its cursor will be a pointer, your links will always work. So one of the other important things to consider is reflows. Who here knows what a browser reflow is? Okay, sweet, a couple. reflows will be one of the big death points. And again, if there were like a couple points you walked away with and decided to go and Google a little bit more about, understanding reflows, I would say, is very, very important. So I stole a definition from the link that's pasted below there. But basically what a reflow is when the browser's having to go through and just figure out what's on the screen and where it is, and this is a very expensive operation. Depending on, I don't want to say it's the most expensive operation your app's doing because you can easily write stuff that chews through more resources than that. But if you're writing good code, this is probably in the top tier of expensive operations your phone's doing. So you want to avoid reflows as much as possible. And again, sometimes we get existing apps, and our job is to go and make them feel great. And the first thing we do is start cutting out all of the unnecessary reflows. To do that, we need to know, though, what causes a reflow. So again, you can go to all of the links I've posted down below if you want to see a lot more detail. But a couple of things that cause reflow, obviously, if we decide to resize the browser window, we're going to cause a reflow. The browser needs to go and figure out what's happening where again. If we're using JavaScript to change any styles, if we're adding or removing elements from the DOM, if we're changing classes, you can imagine every single one of these will cause a reflow. So our game becomes, can we do this as little as possible? And when we do, can we kind of limit the damage that will happen from causing a reflow? So one of the biggest things, and it is using CSS transforms. If you haven't seen a CSS transform, one of the easiest examples is that you can use it to move an item on a page. That would be your translate functions. The equivalent, if you come from a traditional CSS background, would be that you'd be maybe positioning absolute something, and you'd say top 0, left 0. And then a second later, you'd say top 10, left 10. Then you'd say top 20, right 20, and you'd slowly move an element like this. Every time you do it that way, you're going to cause a reflow. If you use transforms, much less of a problem. It's one of those things where if you haven't seen transforms before, they seem really strange and not what you're used to. They do absolutely make sense, though, if you spend just an hour or two getting into the docs. I actually think that if you learned transforms first and then came back to position absolute, you'd be just as baffled as to why it was approached that way. So just understand that sometimes those notions come from what you know. Another little tick is visibility hidden. So again, sometimes people are very, very well-meaning, and they want to make an element not show up anymore. So they do display none or something like that. And when you do display none, you're going to cause a reflow. If you visibility hidden, not going to be a problem. So if you need to make an element temporarily disappear, as much as you can, use something like visibility hidden. So this is a wall of text I don't plan on going through. Just sometimes I add stuff to slides so that when it goes online, there's some value in having a look at them. This comes from, where did I pull this from? Okay, so this is straight from the PhoneGap site. They have a bit of a top 10 list in terms of how you could avoid reflow. Some of it's what we've already discussed. There's some new content in there. Again, just if you're actually into development and you're building more than one of these apps, it really does pay off to go and actually read the Cordova documentation, to actually go and read the PhoneGap documentation. Because so many times they'll say, hey, are you having this problem? Here's exactly what you should do. And then you go and Google the same problem, and you see 20 people asking on Stack Overflow who have clearly just not read the docs. RTFM, that's a real thing. One of the other little tips or hacks that we do all of the time is, depending on what phone you're building for, you'll end up in a state where clicked links have some type of highlighting, just like on a website. And we want to disable that because when I click the same button in my Twitter app, it doesn't do that. Little CSS rule that will make that not be a thing. And again, for a user, now we're behaving much more like an app. Sweet, I'm just checking time. Great. Another thing that you want to be careful of is just knowing the viewport. This is one of those issues where if you haven't done a lot of Cordova stuff, this may throw you a little bit. I've watched people try and solve this a lot of different ways. But if you're dealing with Android, imagine that the keyboard overlays the DOM. And your screen size is still that screen size, and the keyboard is an overlay. As of iOS 7 Plus, the default is that it will actually change the size, right? And the keyboard will actually push everything up a little bit. This is especially important if you're using something like a VHVW or any of those relative units, because your viewport size has actually changed when the keyboard is open on iOS. Interestingly, I think it's 7 Plus. I need to confirm. I wrote 7 Plus. That's probably what it is. I wrote these slides a little bit before. There are a couple of ways to get around this. I'll get into how we can have a relationship with the keyboard in a second. You can also just decide to actually break out some Objective-C and manage this yourself. But a lot of the time, that's out of reach for a pure Cordova team, so they don't want to do that. So one thing you can do is just have a relationship with the keyboard. I'm a fan of Ionic keyboard personally. I just find that the hooks that I get work a little bit better, and it gives me what I need. So Ionic keyboard is a Cordova plugin. You can install it. I always forget the syntax. I think it's Cordova plugin add Ionic or whatever it is. I just have all of these things namespaced. And it just lets you know, so, like, hey, the keyboard's open right now. And then you can go and do any resizing that you want. Or, hey, the keyboard is open right now and it's 400 pixels. It's really worth doing this because you'll find that, especially if you're doing, a user registration form or a verification code, or asking somebody to type in a password, you want to have a bit more control over the keyboard. What's interesting is where this may really start to hurt you. I've seen a lot of times people have a form where you have to type in a username and a password, and they'll have a submit button, and that submit button will change colors or become not disabled because the form's now correct. But in the act of doing that, they've just caused a reflow. And if they're on iOS 7 and the keyboard's up and they had relative units, now that element or button just became half of its size. So this is where that starts to interplay, and the more you just open the keyboard, look at its size, and resize, the easier things will be for you. Another thing people implement on most of their Cordova apps is infinite scrolls. I assume we all know what infinite scroll is. As much as you can, use a library to handle something like that. It is just better. Generally speaking, somebody will write a better version than you because they've spent a lot longer than you have already on it. They've already found the bugs. There are 3 implementations specific to Ember that are pretty good. Smoke and Mirrors up the top is the one that I use. I'll get into that in a second because it has some extra helpers for you. Ember List View, I think, was the first that came out. And you have Ember Cloaking as well. Ember Cloaking is built in Toronto. It's actually written by a Toronto guy. So if you want to do Toronto stuff, use Ember Cloaking. Doesn't really matter which one you pick. One of the most important things about infinite scroll, though, is you can build an infinite scroll in 2 ways. The way that people who haven't done a lot of apps before will build an infinite scroll is they treat the phone as this little viewport under which we're looking at the world, and there is this much larger list of items, and they kind of just rotate that list up and down with perspective into the viewport, which kind of makes sense until you consider that, oh shit, that means we have this big long list that we're continuing to render on the DOM that we really don't need and that we really don't want. So this is where occlusion comes in. Anybody know what occlusion is? Sweet. Hooray! Let's not go back there. So basically what occlusion is that it lets us, I'll go back to that slide in a second, say, hey, when this element is no longer on the screen, we're actually going to undraw it in some ways, or make its visibility gone. And the reason we do that is now it's not necessarily part of the DOM. We're not going to hit those expensive reflow operations. So as much as you can, when that infinite scroll element is getting off the page, you don't really want it to be part of that page anymore. This becomes especially important when you're actually creating an infinite list, right? The bigger the list gets, the more you don't want to be jamming shit into the DOM, the more something like an occlusion will matter very deeply for you. So this is just a bit of an example with Smoke and Mirrors. What the example I'm about to show you is he's adding just a bunch of items in very rapid sequence to a list. Because it's an infinite list and it's using occlusion, you'll notice that we don't get choppy as he's just jamming more and more and more items into the list. So very important concept if you're doing infinite scroll, but it's also worth understanding occlusion just because you'll find you're using it in other cases once you kind of get your head around it. Smoke and Mirrors, again, is a library that will give you a lot of this stuff for free in your Ember app. If you use Angular or React, there's probably an equivalent. The wonderful part of the world right now is that we're all writing JavaScript anyway, so if there's not an equivalent, you can probably port that library and only change the Ember bindings. So just jumping back as well, the other place where using something like a Smoke and Mirrors is good is, if you're doing a left to right scroller. Sometimes I see people and they understand infinite scroll, I need to undo elements, then they have these left to right image carousels and they're doing the exact same fucking thing, and they just think because it's going left to right, this must be different. Just understand that this applies everywhere. One of the other things I just wanted to bring up was, how we handle animations. Obviously, as much as you can, you want to use your CSS transforms. Sometimes they won't give you what you need, or you want a bit more granular control. The first thing people do is they seem to go to jQuery animations. Please never, ever, ever do that. It's never the right idea, and it's not going to work for you. A few reasons as to why, but just consider it's much more inefficient. If you're interested in learning why, go to velocity.js, which I'll have a link on the next page. There's actually quite a lot of details in terms of why they've built Velocity to be more efficient than jQuery. But the example I want to show you, this is from the Velocity main page, and you'll see that it's about to do a simulation of 200 elements with jQuery, and it's just going to swipe them left to right on the screen. You'll see that starts to get pretty choppy pretty fast. Especially with animations like this, sometimes the bind people get in is most programmers seem to use the newest iPhone, and the jQuery animations might look pretty fine, and they go and use it on a 2-year-old Android phone, and it just doesn't work, and it looks and feels like that. Basically, this is what it feels like. So I'm a big fan of using Velocity. It will take most of these problems away. Sometimes people don't like using Velocity. I think it's because it feels, again, a little bit more complex. It's only a little bit more complex until you read the docs and understand that it's not trying to be jQuery animations. It's something a little bit different. But to show you the same test with Velocity, so it's much smoother already. So pro tip, use Velocity wherever possible. Again, we inherit a lot of existing Cordova apps, and one of the first things we have to do is, if they're there, go and rip out any jQuery animation and move them to Velocity. So one of the other things I just wanted to talk about briefly, if you saw me at FITC last time, this is the only repeat slide, but it's worth pointing out. So last time I really spoke about how we're building rapid prototypes with Ember and Cordova. And one of the issues sometimes is that no matter what you do, you can only animate the DOM so fast, right? The DOM is this big chain that's always holding you down. And to give you an example, we had this list that we wanted to drag. And you'll notice that's not very responsive, right? We want it to be snappy. We wanted this to be just like on Gmail or on Mailbox if you used it, where you swipe left and the element follows your finger, and you swipe right and the element follows your finger. If you're really good, you can actually manage that in the DOM, but there are a lot of scenarios where that's not really possible. And this is where we start looking at something like a canvas. I'm not necessarily sold that we'll be needing to use canvas years and years and years from now. There are a lot of hacks and ways that we can start to do things in the DOM. But generally speaking, if you want to get better than 16 milliseconds, that's pretty hard to impossible. And you want to start going to a canvas to show you the same animation in a canvas application. Do I need to press it again? I do. So again, just makes it feel infinitely smoother, and this is the game you're playing. You're just trying to make your app feel much more and more smoother. Thank you. And so far, we're still in an environment where nothing we've done we wouldn't use on, well, we wouldn't not use on desktop, right? Everything that you've done will reapply to a desktop application. One of the other last points I want to make is Mirage. This is an Ember-specific thing, and this is more a developer happiness item. But if you consider your development flow, the environment you can end up into all too frequently is that you're not making those last mile optimizations because you don't have time. And a lot of the time you haven't had time because you're bouncing back and forth between trying to make your API give you the data you need so that you can go and finish writing your Ember application. What Mirage does is it lets you define factories within Ember, and then it will actually simulate an API response back, so you don't even need to worry about having built an API yet. In a lot of ways, it's a replacement for fixtures or whatever it is that you're used to using. So the other reason this is useful is because you can reuse those factories in your Ember tests. And now you have no excuse to having not written tests. Hooray, developers are happy. So I think, 2 points left. Another library you want to look at is called Liquidfire. As I said, this talk is really just stuff Alex does to make his Ember apps feel better. Liquidfire lets you handle the transitions between routes, would be the Ember way of saying it. But if you don't write Ember, imagine that when you click on a new page and you're loading the new page, we know how a web browser handles this, right? Content disappears, other content appears. Sometimes we want to make that feel a little bit smoother, and we want it to swoosh to the left as it's transitioning pages, or go upwards to the right as it's transitioning pages. Liquidfire is a library that will just handle this in Ember for you. What you do is, once you've installed it, you just create a transitions.js file, and you define a standard transition. And a standard transition might be, hey, every time you change pages, I want you to whoosh to the left. And you can also define custom transitions. So you might say when we're going from user register to user profile, I want you to swoosh upwards instead. Again, you can do all of this manually, but use these libraries. They're there. They're very well vetted by the community. They'll save you a ton of time. The other place where a liquid fire would be really helpful for you is you can also use it on a data binding. So say you have a clock and it's ticking, and every second you're going to change that integer, but instead of it just appearing on the page, you want it to maybe rotate or fade in or something. This would be a case for a liquid fire, where in your transitions file you can just define what that looks like. Last thing that I use in basically every project is something called crosswalk. Has anybody here used crosswalk before? Sweet, a few people. So crosswalk is amazing in my opinion. Not everybody loves it, but it saved me a lot of heartache at times. Basically what crosswalk does is it standardizes the way your Android browser will work, or at least this is why I like using it. You can end up in scenarios at times where things are just going to work differently on Android, depending on how old the phone is, depending on what it implements. Crosswalk just lets you deal with a standard set of features and not worry about the fact that you're in a fragmented ecosystem, so you can actually just write your Android code. And it actually leads to this hilarious scenario where instead of dealing with an infinite number of Android devices and only 2 different iOS versions, now you're only dealing with 1 Android version and still 2 iOS versions, and then you start actually hating Apple, which is this very weird scenario. So that's basically what I had. I think we have a couple of minutes left, so I guess this is where I close and see if there's any questions. Yes?
You were showing the swiping motion done in Canvas.
Yep.
Is it also possible to just write that as like a native layer?
Yes, so yes and no. I mean, at any time you're building a Cordova application, you can write native if you want. Your challenge in that scenario would be, trying to otherwise interact with the DOM within the Ember application. Generally speaking, you absolutely could. The reason I do it with a canvas is because that fits within my Ember application. I'm very much about compartmentalizing things in the right places, and I don't really want to end up in a spot where the Ember app otherwise wouldn't work in isolation. Whereas if you use something like a canvas, I can go and boot the same application for web, and it will work just fine. So that's generally why I'd approach it that way. Sweet. Yes?
So you touched on velocity and liquid fire, or
Yep.
what's the difference between the two, and why wouldn't you use the...
Okay, sweet. No, good question. And I should have mentioned this, that liquid fire actually uses velocity. So what you start to realize is that when you get into this community, you realize how interrelated a lot of the libraries and tools are. The distinction would be that you'd use liquid fire to transition between a page, or the fact that data's just changed, that you may use velocity because you manually need to make an element slide up, or you want to make a button do something when it's being tapped, right? You want it to glow or whatever. That's maybe a bit more of a velocity concern, but by the act of importing liquid fire, you've already imported velocity and you have it to use. So, sweet. Yes?
How do you unify code base? How do you make apps look distinctive in the way that an Android app looks like an Android app and an iOS app?
So that's a totally fair question. To be honest, I usually just avoid this problem, and I'm less worried about that personally. In scenarios where I have clients who are, this is when we just start, using selective style sheets or whatever way you like to call that. I wouldn't say it's the most canonical example, but it's the easiest to talk about while I'm up here, is that, within Cordova, you actually know whether you're running on iOS or Android. And unfortunately, it's a little bit hacky. People in Ember do sometimes say, hey, this is iOS. I'm going to import this style sheet, and they do it in the actual, as the app is booting. Sweet. Yes? Sorry, is it possible for... sorry, I can't hear. I'm just going to go closer. Oh, is it possible to use WK WebView? I believe so. This is honestly not where I've needed to experiment lately. There's probably somebody here who can answer. Sweet. This is easy. I don't even have to do the work. Anybody else? Well, yep. Yeah, totally. So I guess one of the distinctions that I very rarely actually use the emulator. I actually much prefer just flashing it onto my phone at all times. I find that that's actually faster for me in some scenarios. It might just be because I'm doing a lot of other things, and obviously when you're running it on the phone, depending on whether you're running for iOS or Chrome, I assume everybody here is familiar that you can do remote debugging on Safari, and you just plug it in, you turn, I can't remember what the dev setting is, then you can actually within Safari go to developer and actually see your iPhone and load up any applications, and you can still access console and interact with your app through console or the DOM. The equivalent in Chrome is, I think it's Chrome//inspect. I just have all this stuff in my hotkeys and I know what I'm doing. And you can do the same thing and pop open the app to have a look. To be honest, I don't rely on that very much, but where I find it's useful is if I have a CSS rule that I thought should apply and something didn't work. And I just want to open it and see what's actually going on here, and if I change the CSS, what will happen. Anybody else? Great. Thank you very much.